I am delighted to welcome this morning, rather afternoon, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. I wish I could say he needs no introduction because it's really true. One of the doyens of our country's modern economic history. And Montek, you had I would say, a great, if not disproportionate influence in policy making. We learned a lot from your recent autobiography too. How does it feel? We are welcoming you back to Gokhale Institute, I think after a long gap of perhaps 25 years. You gave the Kale Memorial Lecture here, and earlier you were here at an international conference. How does it feel to be back in Gokhale Institute and in Pune?
Well, both feel very good. I mean, Pune, of course, I've been to Pune before, and I know that it's one of the cities that sort of reflects the changing character of the Indian economy. It's really nice to be back in Pune. And also nice to be back in the Gokhale Institute. And I've been here before, but in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, I've been taking more of an interest in the history of things. And when I visited earlier, I didn't have an adequate appreciation of the historical importance of this institution. And I must thank you for, first of all, taking me to Gokhale's house, very charming, modest sort of building, and also to what used to be the library, where you tell me that the Constituent Assembly had its informal meetings. And I mean, that's a real privilege. I'm looking forward to you sending me the pictures of us in front of that huge table. And I think we need to be more aware of how things have evolved over time. And maybe certainly when I was a student, I later discovered, and I said that in my book, Backstage, we were not adequately aware of the debates and differences of view in economics that existed even then. I mean, for example, I would have thought that having done a BA honors in economics, I should have been much more aware of the fact that, B.R. Shenoy did not actually agree with the second plan, and not only he didn't agree, but he wrote a minute of dissent. We need more awareness of this. People need to know that when big choices are made, there are alternatives. You make a choice. You may be right, you may be wrong. But I think that should be part of education. And this visit, I'm particularly conscious of it because I'm now taking more interest in history. So I'm grateful to you for
Thank you.
taking me through this.
Indeed, it is a very historic place, and in fact, this very place under the Banyan tree, this has witnessed talks by the likes of Dr. Ambedkar and others. I want to remind our viewers that your economic sort of influence began very early with you topping the PPE, the Politics, Philosophy and Economics program at Oxford. And ever since then, of course, you have gone from step to step, the World Bank and then back in India. Since you now have sort of a long view of how economic policy making is done, how it is actually manifests, I remember you mentioning how it has to be tempered by the practicality of advice. What would you say to our young people who are trying to be policymakers, economic policymakers?
Now, it's both a good and a difficult question, because I just started with history, and I said it's very important for them to know that, there have been debates in the past, but I think it's equally important for them to know that the future is going to be very different from the past. So I think one needs to look at the past to see how differences were resolved, and particularly in this institution, because after all, Gokhale was viewed as the original constitutionalist.
Yes.
And how do you bring about change? And there were other views, very distinguished people who had different views. But for younger people, I think they're entering a period when there's going to be much more change than, let us say, was the case 30 years ago. Because I think what you're now seeing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this during my lecture later on, you're seeing India having come out of that low-income category and trying to get on with becoming a middle-income society. So it's a more sophisticated economy, nowhere near where it needs to be. But I think you need to be aware that structural changes are taking place and you need to play to the strength of those changes. I mean, what do those changes require? Do they require more public sector or more private sector? Do they require more central government control or less central government control?
Are those debates settled?
No, no. My view is no debate is ever settled, but the important thing is they should happen, and I don't think we are doing enough of that. We should open up, open up the, if you like, the space for discussion, so different people take a look at what should be happening. I mean, how do we handle states? And after all, we are not just a big country and a diverse country. We're a big country in which some of our states are already very close to escaping the middle income level.
Yes.
And there are some that are really not even in middle income. So, what is the best economic environment that can bring out the best in two very different types? And I feel that we never, even recently, we have never adequately analyzed what is the relevant strategy for one state versus another. I mean, when I was deputy chairman of the planning commission, I used to tell our guys that, you know, you should do notes on each state which highlight the fact that, you know, while we have a general mantra for everybody, for this state, this is what really matters. And that's not easy to do. But, you know, how to do it is a challenge.
You had a very long stint, and although you were very influential in the earlier reform period, but you also had, I think, a great amount of influence as a very long stint in the planning commission. I want to ask you, and that was also a period where supposedly we went increasingly in the direction of the rights paradigm, you know, the right to education and so on. So, do you think economics as a profession, as a field of study, can it adequately answer these questions? Because increasingly, while we are growing, fast growing, and we are a large economy, there are concerns about inequality and widening inequality. So, do you think economics can give us answers to how much inequality is okay, or if it's not okay, what to do about it?
Well, I don't think economics will tell us how much is okay, because it's society that's going to tell us
Yes.
how much is okay. I mean, there's no question that most societies accept a certain amount of inequality. Most societies, if they grow rapidly, are more willing to accept inequality, especially if the growth is inclusive. So, if you can create a situation where people know that inequality is going to increase, but their own opportunities to improve their lives at every decile are going to expand, I think they're more likely to accept it. On the other hand, if you have a growth process which people feel is only benefiting the top maybe 2 or 3 deciles and doing nothing for the rest, it won't be acceptable at all. But that is not a decision that economics gives you. That's a
outside.
socio-political decision. But having decided that, listen, this inequality is unacceptable, we must do better, I think economics will give you the answer of how to handle that. I mean, sociology won't. So you want to do that, you want to handle it in the least cost way. I mean, I'll give you a simple explanation. And many of the people in the, what you call it, civil society, say on things like energy pricing, which is very critical now with climate change. They always say that, you know, energy must be affordable. Now, if you believe that everybody needs energy, which they do, it's absolutely clear that energy must be affordable. But whether it can be made more affordable by raising people's incomes or made affordable just by lowering energy prices, that's an issue. And I think that, depending on which way you go, you can end up with very complex policies addressing your objectives. And probably none of them is perfect.
Yeah.
Whichever way you do, there'll be some mistakes. So that's the nature of policy making. I mean, how do you make those choices?
On policy making, I want to ask you a specific question. I remember you were a member of the famous Growth Commission led by Michael Spence, and one of the distinctive contributions you made is that while economists and economic advisors give a lot of policy advice on what states and governments should do, you insisted that we should also include what you should not do. So So can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very distinguished group. Actually, that particular group was set up by the president of the World Bank
Yes.
just before the financial crisis. It submitted its reports probably a few weeks before Lehman Brothers collapsed. And that, of course, created a whole new world. So the report was never looked at by virtually anybody. But I think it's quite a nice report. And one of the things I raised in the discussion is that there is a kind of boring commonality between the list of reforms that everyone has. And I pointed out that, look, if a minister were to give this big fat report to one of his civil servants and say, is there anything new here? I mean, the chaps would say, well, these are the things not only we've heard, but we also agree. Of course, they're difficult to implement, etc., etc. I said, if you want to attract people's attention, have a list of 10 unambiguously bad ideas so that people would be able to say, when somebody asks, what's new in this report, is the first report that has a list of bad ideas. And it does have the usual list of bad ideas. I don't know whether anybody is actually was influenced by them, but you need a consensus on what are bad ideas, just as much as you need a consensus on what are good ideas.
Like, for example, I think protectionism, raising walls of protection is a bad idea. So speaking of ideas,
We did say that, by the way.
You did
We
say
said that's a bad idea. Going for public sector enterprises where private sector is already there is a bad idea. Subsidies that are beyond your fiscal capacity, a bad idea, and so on.
oh, good. Thank you. I strongly recommend that people read the don'ts list. So speaking of ideas, and if you want to battle ideas, if you want to drive out bad ideas, you need to fight in the marketplace or the battle space of ideas. And what better place than a university?
Absolutely.
And in fact, Mr. Keynes said that it is not vested interest, but ideas which will sustain in the long run. So I want you to maybe sort of tell our youngsters the importance of battle of ideas. I mean, if you want to disagree, but disagree in a very civil discourse, and
That's actually
especially in light of
it's
all the
well
polarization we are seeing. So I'd like
it
to
is
sort of-
well established in our own ancient scriptures, because I think it's the Nyaya Sutras that lay down the three different types of discourse and tell students their pros and cons. I mean, the first is what they call Vad. That is a discussion and is characterized by each individual knowing what the other individual is trying to establish, everybody agreeing on the rules of argument, everybody agreeing that you're not going to make fun of the other fellow or insult the other fellow. And as a result of that discussion, you both reach knowledge. So it's not as if one person loses and the other person wins, both gain knowledge. That's the ideal. Then you have something which they call Jalpa. And Jalpa is where each person is actually trying to prove his point. So his main concern is not a joint search for knowledge, but just to disprove the other fellow. And that has a lot of, you can see that's what happens in a court of law. I mean, when you hire a lawyer, you expect him to disprove the other fellow.
That's right.
You don't expect him to go and say that if I were the judge, this is what I think the conclusion should be. So that has a certain, and I guess in parliamentary debate also, two different sides, each arguing its point, but arguing it within a framework. What are the rules of argument? What's a legitimate argument? Maybe you can make a little bit of fun of the other person, but it has to be a reasoned argument. And the last kind of argument is what our scriptures call vitand. And that is very interesting. There, you don't even have to prove your point. You just have to insult the other fellow. Demolish. And I fear that 95% of what our students get through social media is actually vitand. Almost never get vad and even don't get jalpa. So quite frankly, if there was some way in which people could recognize when they observe a process, what are we observing? Are we observing vad? Are we observing jalpa, or are we observing vitand? And if the latter, just switch off the TV because it's not worth it. I think that's very important.
Fantastic. I mean, really wonderful. This is a great advice. I know time is short, so I need to wrap up because there's no way we can fit in your vast amount of knowledge and experience. I would recommend to the viewers, for starters, to read your autobiography called Backstage, which came out, I think, 3 years
Thank
ago.
you.
It's a wonderful, very easy and very engaging book. And of course, someone who's former vice chairman of Planning Commission, finance secretary, long innings in the economic landscape of India. And good to see you here and in good health. So we wish you a long and happy, healthy life. And please come back to Gokhale more often.
I'd love to do that. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ajit.
Thank you, Montek.
Nice
Thank
to
you.
be here.